Hi, this is Greg again with Telltale Books, here to give you another H.G. Wells review on the next book on my quest to read everything I can get my hands on by H.G. Wells. The next one, I'm in the year 1901. The only science fiction novel he wrote that year was The First Men in the Moon. And this is the book that I have First Men in the Moon in, along with Time Machine, Island of Dr. Moreau, Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, and Food of the Gods. And so I still have to read The Food of the Gods. That's coming up in 1904. The other four novels I've already read. And I have done videos on the Time Machine and the Island of Dr. Moreau. So, The First Men in the Moon. I'm doing this one alone. Emily's not joining me for this one. I don't know if she doesn't really love H.G. Wells all that much or what, but she just didn't want to read this one. So I did this one on my own, as I'm doing most of the H.G. Wells reads. I'm doing this mostly on my own. And interesting thing happened, which I talked about with the last book, The Love and Mr. Lewisham. Beginning after When the Sleeper Wakes, Wells wanted to distance himself from the scientific romance genre that he was building, and the connection to these I'm not sure what the right word is. They were published in magazines of popular fiction, along with Sherlock Holmes and a lot of other popular writers. And it wasn't really considered literature. It was considered adventures. It was considered popular entertainment. It wasn't taken seriously as literature, and the writers weren't taken seriously as writers. And H.G. Wells wanted to be taken as seriously as his friend Henry James was being taken. So he wanted to write more serious novels. But after Love and Mr. Lewisham, he went back to science fiction for a couple more novels. The first one he went back to was The First Men in the Moon. And his desire to get away from the scientific romances kind of shows in First Men in the Moon. It's not as good as his earlier science fiction novels. I read this book as one of the very first books I read for enjoyment way back in 1977 in a Magnum Easy Eye paperback edition, and loved it, but rereading it today, there are certain things I'm seeing here. Number one, The First Man in the Moon is a great exercise in world building. He really builds this whole Selenite culture, this Selenite civilization, and for his day did an excellent job of trying to imagine what the moon might be like if the moon had life and some atmosphere and a civilization. And he did a great job building this world. It was really an exercise in fantasy. I don't think Wells took it all that seriously on a scientific basis, except for his descriptions of things like anti-gravity and the differences in gravity between the Earth and the Moon and things like that. Beyond that, I don't think Wells really saw this as a serious scientific romance. I think he was just having fun, writing a fantasy. I think he knew that what he was writing was not very scientifically accurate, and he didn't care. I think he just let his imagination go and had fun with this. One of the things I like is his Dr. Caver, Professor Caver. This guy feels a lot like Doctor Who. It's almost like when they wrote Doctor Who, they looked back at First Man in the Moon and modeled the Doctor after Professor Caver. Kind of of an odd, awkward, somewhat of a buffoon of a man, yet incredibly brilliant. Very lovable character, but kind of laughable too. Kind of a joke of a character. This book, The First Man in the Moon, it isn't a laugh a minute. This isn't written for comedy, but Wells did put a lot of comedy into it. There's a lot of it that isn't to be taken too seriously. He was having fun, writing some jokes, just having a good time with this book. Unfortunately, as brilliant as his fantastical world building is in this book, and as much as I love his characters, the story itself really doesn't hold together well. Because, the beginning of the book naturally is all about the invention of Cavorite and, putting together the spaceship and traveling to the moon, just getting us from point A to point B so that the adventure can start. So then the adventure starts. The characters go and they meet the Selenites, but they right away pick a fight and they kill some Selenites and they run away. They escape out of the crater where because the Selenites live under the surface. They escape out to the surface and they're looking for the spaceship, and they go separate ways. Cavor gets captured. The other character finds a spaceship. He goes back to get Cavor, but he finds a note from Cavor and some blood and a hat that Cavor had, and realized Cavor must have been captured, and he wasn't sure if Cavor was even alive. So he gets in the spaceship, goes back to Earth. Okay, and that's really the end of the adventure. So there's this adventure story that's very quick, very short, and then you're back on Earth. And then you have this whole section at the end of the book where Cavor invents a radio and sends messages back to Earth, and he's talking about the Selenite society and such. And it's just exposition. It's like a scientific textbook almost. It's just not all that interesting. It's like you read early science fiction from like Amazing Stories or Astounding, and the story stops so that the characters can stand and talk about the science, and it comes across really ridiculous today. And Wells made that mistake with First Man in the Moon, that 20 or 30 pages of the end of this 140-page book in this, the way it's said in this volume, the last 20 to 30 pages are kind of dull. There's no story. It's just all describing the Selenite society, which is interesting, but it's a good example of an author making the mistake of telling you, not showing you. And makes it a little hard for the modern reader expecting a whole plot to push themselves through the end of this book, because there's not a lot there going on. This isn't a lot there to read. So I of all the works I've read by Wells so far, from The Time Machine all the way up to First Man in the Moon, of all these books I've been reading, First Man in the Moon has my vote as his weakest novel. It's not a really strong plot. He makes mistakes that writers are told, don't do this. Wells did it, made those mistakes. And then if you're looking for science fiction, this really isn't. Especially by today's standards, the science, even if the science would have been accurate in 1901, definitely not accurate to what we know today. So, but even in 1901, the idea of this whole magical Cavorite chemical that resists gravity and lets them shoot off the earth. I mean, Wells must have known that this was not at all scientific, that it was pure fantasy. And then the fact that he doesn't take himself seriously. There's even one point where the character, when he's back on Earth, instead of using his own name because he has some bad debts that he doesn't want his debtors coming after him, he chooses to use the name of Wells because it sounds like a respectable name. I mean, Wells is even poking fun at himself and cracking jokes about himself. Not to say this isn't an enjoyable story. If I was going to give it a star rating on a 5-star scale, I think I would give it a 4-star rating, mainly because it is H.G. Wells and it is such good world building. But any other author could never have pulled this book off because of the bad things that Wells does with this book. He can pull it off. Anybody else, this would be a horrible novel. Structure-wise, it just isn't what it should have been, and isn't what it could have been. I mean, even within what Wells did with this, making it lighthearted, more of a science fantasy, there are things he could easily have done to make this a much faster paced, more enjoyable novel. Like I say, showing instead of telling. Not taking us 2/3 of the way through the book, having the characters split up. The character that we're following is safely back on Earth. And then using this I'm sure in 1901, I mean, Marconi was pretty new, radio was pretty new. I'm sure Wells was thinking he was showing people something magnificent, showing that, and yes, we do know today that radio would work from the moon and send signals back that we could pick up and hear. We've sent television signals back from the moon. That was a whole new idea at that time, and most people wouldn't have realized, even the people who were aware of what Marconi did, they probably wouldn't have realized that those radio signals would reach from the moon. And Wells was probably throwing that in as kind of an astonishing, hey, here's a scientific fact. Marconi's radio would work from the moon to send messages back from the moon, and it would take 2 seconds to reach us. There was probably some of that going on, but that whole device just really, really makes the ending anticlimactic and gives you this very long ending of the book that could just have been so much more fun if he would have handled it differently. So, First Man in the Moon, reading it as an adult now, I loved it as a teenager, but reading it as an adult, it's coming across as a disappointment based on what I know now of fiction and the better novels that I've read since I read First Man in the Moon, even comparing it to the other H.G. Wells novels based on what I know now about novels and writing. First Man in the Moon is his weakest effort so far. So, but I would definitely, who would I recommend this book to? I would recommend it to anybody who, like me, has to read everything of H.G. Wells. I would recommend it to anybody who really wants to cover all the best of the early science fiction and doesn't want to miss a fairly important work in the development of science fiction. I would recommend it to anybody who it's a relatively short novel. If you just want to have a diversion, something that isn't going to be one of the greatest books ever written, but it's still going to be fun, the book is mostly fun. It's just the ending is slow. I would recommend it to anybody who wants to read a very early, possibly counts as one of the very first examples of science fiction world building. It's one of the first examples of building a world on another planet, and really is. I mean, this predates Edgar Rice Burroughs. It predates Lord of the Rings. It predates most of the books that we think of as strong world-building books. And in a very short novel, Wells built a really interesting society, an insect-based society, and but one which has its own science and its own ecology and its own beings and its own laws, and is very different from anything on Earth. A really good example of building an alien world different from what we have here on Earth. Even though he did just kind of base it on an ant colony, so he didn't go too far, but still, considering nobody was doing this sort of thing at the time this book was written. The first examples of world building an alien world are literally the War of the Worlds and the First Men in the Moon. Everything before that was pretty simplistic in its vision of other worlds on the moon or on Mars or wherever. They just didn't go as far as Wells did. So it's a good book and worth your time reading it. Just don't look for this to be a great book. It doesn't quite make it. It doesn't quite live up to that. It just falls short. So with that, I'm on to a nonfiction work by Wells, written and published in 1901, called Anticipations. The full name is a lot longer. It's usually just shortened to Anticipations. It's a series of non-fictional essays speculating on what is to come in the near future. And it's very well known. It's one of his very first non-fiction works. It ought to be a good one. And with Emily, we have some really good things coming up. For one thing, we have just finished reading and are going to do a video review of Gideon the Ninth. Finally, we've had this on our list for quite a while. Harrow the Ninth has already come out. We finally got around to reading this, and we're going to review it. And we both liked it. It ought to be an interesting video. We're going to have a lively discussion about that. There's a lot to talk about in that book. Very surprising piece. And then, like I say, I've got Anticipations coming up in my H.G. Wells quest, and a lot of great things coming up for next year. So keep coming back and give us suggestions of anything you want us to see us read and review next year, because we'll completely listen to anybody's suggestions. Somebody did suggest a couple months ago we should do Jurassic Park, and now it's just a matter of us finding the time to read it and do the video and fit it into our schedule. It's really just a matter of that. We want to do it. Neither of us has really read it. We both have seen the movie and loved it. We want to do that review, so that should be coming up sometime in the near future, as soon as we can get copies and find time to read it and get together to shoot that video. So keep coming back and give us suggestions. Tell us what you think. If you read First Men in the Moon, let's have a conversation. Get a conversation going. Post on our YouTube video. Post on our Facebook page. Post on Instagram. Any of those places. We'd love to hear from you. So let us know. And we'll be back next Friday with more video reviews or whatever we can think of to talk about. So thanks for stopping and listening to me tonight.